All right, so I think we'll kick it off here, and then I'll remind people as we go who I'm talking to and what we're talking about. So if we have late joiners, they know where we are. So, hey, everybody, thank you for joining us. I'm Emily with Likewise, and we are delighted to have Megan Miranda with us in the Book Club Favorites Room to talk about her newest mystery thriller, The Last to Vanish. Megan is the New York Times bestselling author of Such a Quiet Place, All the Missing Girls, The Perfect Stranger, The Last House Guest, which was a Reese Witherspoon book club pick, and The Girl from Widow Hills. She's also written several books for young adults. She grew up in New Jersey, graduated from MIT, and she lives in North Carolina with her husband and her children now. And The Last to Vanish is her newest book. It's set in Cutter's Pass, which is a little town in the foothills below the Appalachian Trail. Cutter's Pass is a charming tourist destination, but it's also infamous for the 7 hikers who've disappeared after last being seen in the town over the last 25 years. The last person to vanish was a journalist named Landon West, who was asking questions about some of the earlier disappearances. The main character is a woman named Abby Lovett. She manages the Passage Inn, which is a resort on the edge of town with a trail that leads up to the Appalachian Trail, so a place where a lot of hikers stay. Abby has worked at the Passage Inn for a decade, but in some ways she's still kind of an outsider in this close-knit community of Cutter's Pass. She's mostly kind of kept the disappearances out of her mind, but then the missing journalist's brother, Trey, shows up looking for answers about what could have happened to Landon, and she's kind of drawn into this investigation. So Megan, thank you so much for being with us, and congratulations. This book is on the New York Times bestseller list. Very exciting.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everyone for joining. I'm so excited to chat today.
I really enjoyed this book, and I'm really excited to talk to you about it. And as I was saying when we were kind of chatting before, we will try to keep this conversation spoiler-free for all the listeners who haven't read the book yet.
Yes.
And listeners, if you have a question for Megan at any point during the event, please put it in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that and kind of incorporate those as we go along. So, Megan, I talked a little bit about the novel, but I'm wondering if you can start by telling us just about the inspiration. I read that you spent a lot of time in the woods as a kid.
Yes, I did. So my parents were like avid hikers. So up until the age of 18, I would say that I was the same. I grew up hiking everywhere from like Virginia to Maine. Absolutely find a lot of inspiration in the woods and the mountains. And I kind of moved away from it after in my early adulthood when I didn't have to do it with my parents anymore, and then came full circle back to hiking when I had children of my own as an adult. And so for this story in particular, I first got the sense of the story and the voice of my main character when I was walking on a trail that connects through my neighborhood. And it had just stopped raining, but when I stepped into the trail line, it still sounded like it was. The water was still falling from the trees, and it sounded like this echo of the past. And I immediately got this sense of a place that it felt like the past was still happening right alongside you. And I took out my phone right then and started writing, and kind of got a sense of Abby's voice right then about a place where she felt like when you were seeing something happening, it was too late. It had already happened. And so that idea kind of combined with another idea that had been lingering in the back of my mind for a while. And that was the idea for the town itself. And I was really interested in this idea of a town that had a very notorious and mysterious history, but did not shy away from that history either and chose to embrace it. And even though it's known to outsiders as the most dangerous town in North Carolina, this does not deter anyone from coming. And if anything, it makes them want to come more because they believe that maybe they will be the ones to uncover it.
I love that. And the town is almost a character in the novel itself. Can you tell us a little bit more about Cutter's Pass and what inspired it and how you kind of built out the environment of the town and the characters who live there?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you. Because I usually am someone who starts with a character before the plot. And the first character I came up with for this book was actually the town of Cutter's Pass. And it was really almost the inspiration point for the story itself. So I live in North Carolina, And my kids are in high school and they go on field trips to Charleston. And they had gone on some historical ghost tours and came home and told me about them. And I was so intrigued by this idea of a place that had these sort of like historical walking tours. But what if that past instead was very recent? And we're not talking about history from 100 years ago, but we're talking about history from 25 years ago or 10 years ago, or in the case of the most recent disappearance, only 4 months earlier. And yet it's a town that then embraces it and knows that tourists are drawn to it for that reason. So I love small towns. I love writing about small towns. And Cutter's Pass is this very small mountain resort town. It's set right at the base of one of the trails that intersects with the Appalachian. And it's most famously known beforehand for just its outdoor offerings. There's a lot of hiking trails, there's whitewater rafting, there's horseback riding, just really like this outdoorsy place that people come to for those offerings. And then it became this place that was really known for 7 visitors who've gone missing without a trace. And so I wanted to kind of combine those elements and have it be a place where, yes, hikers come, but also people come who are intrigued by this mystery and trying to uncover it for themselves. And so I started with this idea of trying to craft a history for a place that would make it very notoriously known, but also something that was unsolved for 25 years. So I started with the most famous case, which happened 25 years ago, and it's about 4 young men who are known as the Fraternity Four. They arrive in town to go hiking towards the Appalachian. They're last spotted at a pub in the town, and they're never seen again. And I felt like that's something that would have been very intriguing for people, but probably would have faded with time, kind of attributed to circumstance, if not for the string of disappearances that keeps happening. So then when I was crafting this history, I came up with the other cases. And so 10 years ago, a college student who was on a trip with her class sees Cutter's Pass in the distance, leaves the trail, is never seen again. 3 years ago, a photographer is lured in by the beauty in the winter, last seen with a camera around her neck, never seen again. And then 4 months earlier, a journalist who was staying at this inn, but pretending to be somebody else. Nobody knew he was investigating until he disappeared, but he's staying at this local inn, investigating the string of disappearances. And then he too is never seen again. And that's what really kicks off the story in the present.
So you have alluded to this a little bit. The Last to Vanish is a mystery, but it's not a murder mystery exactly. It's the disappearance mystery. It's not like who did it, but what happened. And as a reader, when I was reading this book, I really noticed the difference. In some ways, it felt maybe like a little more unsettling to me because the question is so much more open. Is that a distinction that you were thinking about when you were writing?
It is. It was something I was thinking about a lot because I feel like, I'm so drawn to the mysteries both as a reader and a writer. And I feel like a disappearance is just so inherently mysterious because you don't even know what it is you're solving at first. There's so many options, even at the beginning. Like, did these people disappear because it was a crime? Did they disappear because it was an accident? Did they choose to disappear and become somebody new? And I think that's also why none of these cases have really gotten enough traction that, individually they lead to kind of this huge investigation. There is something unsettling because there's so much open ended still. And now we have 7 of them. There's 7 people who've disappeared without a trace. And are they connected? Are they not? It's just something, it's a theme I find that I'm drawn to in a lot of my books, this idea of the different ways people can disappear, and why, and, what are we even solving or trying to uncover to begin with?
So, if you're just joining us, we're talking to New York Times bestselling author Megan Miranda about her mystery thriller, The Last to Vanish. And you were mentioning just then that the idea of disappearance is a theme that comes up in a couple of your books. Something else, a theme that I noticed in this one, and I've seen in other of your books, is sort of this exploration of small communities and insiders and outsiders in small communities. What's interesting to you about that dynamic of like belonging or not belonging?
Yeah, I find that there are definitely themes that I'm drawn to over and over. And the way I think about them is as themes are like questions to explore, and you come at them from different angles in different books. And there's not necessarily an answer in mind, but they're just ways to kind of work through topics and ideas and questions. And I find myself really drawn to this tension dynamic between small towns and people who've grown up there and have lived there generations gone back, and people who are visitors or who move to the area new or who are tourists, and kind of see a place from two different perspectives. I think that's the thing I'm most drawn to, is that there's different ways you can view a place or people, whether you are on the inside and have all of this kind of insider information versus someone who has the luxury of a little bit of removal and can see it from the outside in. And I feel like I'm probably drawn to this because I have moved in my adulthood. So, I grew up in New Jersey, and that's where I lived until I was 18. And then I moved to Boston and I lived there for 6 years. And I've now been in North Carolina for 18 years. And I think a lot about what makes a place home. And maybe that's a question that, I've been working through in different books of mine as well. Is, in this book in particular, I feel like Abby kind of she
Mm-hmm.
juggles that border a little bit. Like, she views this place as home. She loves this place. She's been there 10 years. She's chosen this place. She finds it a beautiful place. But for the people who've lived there for generations gone back in this very small town setting, they don't quite see her as somebody who is fully inside that town. And so she has this luxury of being able to see things from the inside, but also from the
Mm-hmm.
outside. And I think in this book in particular, there is this the place of Cutter's Pass almost has this trade off. Like, you can call this place your home, we will take you in. But on the flip side, you have to promise not to dig into our secrets. And that's sort of the line that Abby is walking and has to kind of decide, like, is this place my home, or am I going to, shake the foundation of this life I've built for myself here and start digging into the past?
Yeah, there's a really interesting sort of tension around like secrets and people who know secrets and keep secrets. I'm
Yeah.
trying hard not to like give anything away here. People who know secrets and choose to keep secrets,
Yes.
both sort of directly related to these disappearances and also just sort of related to the town and the people in it, and all of those things. There are a lot of secrets in this book, and it seems like a lot to keep track of. Do you have a system for tracking all the elements of your plot as you're putting something like this that's quite complex with twists and turns together?
I do, but I must admit that when I'm starting, I do not know any of these secrets. I start my books knowing as much as my main characters, sometimes less. I like to go in that way because I feel like I can channel that uncertainty when I'm writing from their perspective, where, Abby doesn't know who
Mm-hmm.
to trust, and neither do I. And so everyone has this like air of suspicion to them. So I do keep, like, I have an Excel spreadsheet that I keep up as I'm writing, but it's something that develops as I'm going. And I have different columns for different elements where, there's plot elements, there's I guess what I would call like clues or plot points that are left dangling. And I kind of have this running plot line of reveals. And so to me, the secrets are like a reveal. There are things that um,
Mm-hmm.
either the narrator or the reader discovers that might shift your way of understanding the context of events. And to me, those are
Mm-hmm.
kind of like how I see a plot unraveling. It's the mysteries that are revealing themselves. And sometimes they're plots, and sometimes, as you said, they're the secrets that different characters are keeping. And usually I discover them as I am writing. And so a lot of my process is in revision But I do think like the secrets is kind of the fun part of unraveling. 'Cause I think the biggest mystery is like the mystery that's inside
Mm-hmm.
other people, and not just the mystery of like the plot itself.
Mm-hmm. I like that a lot. And I think that kind of touches on an audience question, which is, what is the most difficult part of your writing process?
Ooh, that's a great question. So because I am not an upfront plotter, the most difficult part of my writing process is always the middle of a book. So beginnings for me are just so much fun because anything can happen. And I'm just discovering who my characters are and what their relationships are like. What is this place? What's the setting? What's the mystery? And anything is possible. And then when you reach close to the end, you can feel all the threads coming together. And so endings are very exciting. But middles for me are where I have to do a lot of that very difficult actual plotting work, make sure everything is balanced, to make sure there's nothing that's left, hanging, and to make sure it's a plot that the mystery is, satisfying and surprising. And so for me, like the middles of every book are where I have to like buckle down, have my spreadsheets open, um, and really, really work through the fine points of things. I'm jealous of a lot of my writing friends who can kind of plot a book up front and see it from the start, and that's just not my process. I've come to embrace my process, but it is sort of a trial and error and figure things out as you're going. And then, oh, now that I know that, go back and rewrite with all those things in mind.
That does sound very tricky. So if you're just joining us, we're talking to Megan Miranda about her new mystery, The Last to Vanish. This book does what my favorite mysteries do, which is create this very evocative mood and atmosphere and have that compelling plot. How do you think about balancing the detail you need to build a mood? So much of it here is like the isolation, the wilderness, which is both like welcoming and also kind of scary. Um, all of that with you have to keep your plot moving forward so that it is, the secrets are being revealed and there's that satisfying plot element to it too. How do you balance those things?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I love setting, and like we were talking earlier, I really try to see setting as a character, and just like every character has a different relationship with one another, every character has a different relationship with the setting. And so I really try to think about the way a character describes a place or sees a place based on their frame of mind. And I think every one of my main characters begins in a place because they love a place. And this is home, whether it is an inn at the edge of the mountains or, a small suburban community. This is their idea of safety. And then as the story changes, those elements of safety kind of become stripped away a little bit and they see a different side to the place. And suddenly all those elements that were safety and beautiful can now look sort of terrifying and ominous instead. And I think, you know, any place can be the most beautiful place or the most terrifying place. And it really comes down to a character's perspective. And, when a character is afraid, like everything has its element of danger, I think we were saying earlier. And so I really try to use it as much as possible. And so I don't see them as kind of competing elements in the story, but that the setting kind of contributes to this plot and the setting contributes to the tension as well. And so, there's one point in
Mm-hmm.
the book where I think Abby is leading Trey on a walk on the trail and she's trying to show him why she loves this place and why she stays in this place. And they reach this overlook and she's like, look, can you see? You see why I stay? And she looks over and he just has this look of terror on his face because all he sees are the potential for danger where his brother went missing instead. And so I try to use that as much as possible to increase the tension
Mm-hmm.
and to kind of fuel the plot forward. Especially when it comes to thrillers, I feel like, the woods at night or the mountains at night is just, there's so much potential in it. Um, so I write it all. And then when I'm revising, I do kind of,
Mm-hmm.
strip down to the essentials as much as possible and make sure that the plot is still moving, even as we are, hiking in the woods. And that there's different tense elements throughout that are balanced with the description as much as possible.
So you mentioned just a minute ago that you've learned to embrace your
Yeah.
process over the years. And we had a great listener question from a little earlier. How has your writing style changed over the years?
Ooh,
Or has it?
that is a great question. I do think that I feel like my process changes a little bit from book to book, even from, you know, trying to plot things out versus kind of embracing that this is my process. But also, I think in my earlier
Mm-hmm.
books, I would let myself get pretty far in before I started to step back and say to myself, okay, do I know where this story is going? Do I know what the heart of this story is? And because of that, I would have to do a lot more work on the back end. And now what I try to do is to see turning points, and I try to see those up front. So when I start, I think to myself, can I see the turning point that's going to happen maybe 50 to 75 pages in? And it doesn't have to be like a big aha moment, but something that shifts the reader perspective or the narrator's perspective. And to have that in my mind as like a guidepost as I'm writing. And I feel like if I can see that, then I can write to that point. And then once I reach that point, I think to myself, do I know the halfway shift? And then, so I kind of write in quarters, I think, in that way. But I try to have those
Mm-hmm.
waypoints for myself as a way to not let myself get too far down, you know, the wrong path.
Mm-hmm.
And to kind of like see those elements beforehand. There have been books I've had to rewrite 3 or 4 times just to find the right way to tell it. So I really try to minimize that as much as possible at the start. And so thinking about structure up front is something that's really important for me, and something that I give a lot more focus to in my first drafts now. And this book in particular it's told in a forward way in the present, but it's broken into parts based on the missing person notices, and it starts with the most recent missing person, and then as Abby is kind of following that trail of evidence, she gets to the next missing person part, and we learn more about that as we go. So that was very helpful for me as I was writing and kind of mapping it out. I saw the structure a little bit like a trail itself.
That sort of relates to the way that your writings evolved, relates to another great audience question, which is, which of your books has been your favorite to write? Or do you have a favorite of the books you've written?
Ooh, that's a great way of putting it, has it been your favorite to write? Because I think it's very hard to pick a favorite book. It's usually the book I've just finished writing, honestly, because you spend so much time
Mm-hmm.
in a main character's head, like at least a year of time, and you're very invested in their kind of, world and their relationship. So The Last to Vanish is definitely the book that, right now is sort of my favorite. There's definitely books that have lingered for me, and they're usually the ones that have been the most challenging to write. And maybe that's because I spend even longer with these characters and this place. My first book for adults, All the Missing Girls, is told in reverse. So it starts on day 15 and moves back in time to day 1. And it was one of my earlier book ideas, but it was my 6th published novel. If that gives you a sense of kind of how many times I came back to it as like the book idea that wouldn't leave me alone.
Mm-hmm.
And I just felt so drawn to it and these characters. And so because of that, when I reached the end of my first draft of that book, finally, it was one of like the highlights of my career to this day, is sort of like, completing that writing process. And I think I took a lot of joy in that as well. But I usually become completely just very deeply involved in whatever story it is that I'm writing and those characters in that world. And I usually do very much enjoy the writing process.
Speaking of All the Missing Girls, so you mentioned it was your first novel for adults, and you'd written quite a bit for young adults before. Why did you decide to make that transition?
Yeah, I feel like it's seems like a big leap in hindsight, but it felt like a very natural progression and maybe something that was even inspired by my writing the young adult books. So I was always
Hmm.
writing suspense and thrillers. So my young adult were also suspense. And, they have to do with these characters who have these huge things happen to them when they are 16 or 17 years old. And at the end of the story, they kind of, they make it through. I write standalone books and kind of put that story aside. And I like to imagine that they are going on with their lives and doing just fine. And I think it was, a few years later, I would start to think like, I wonder how they're doing. I wonder, is this, something they try to leave behind and pretend didn't happen? Is it something they embrace as part of their identity? And, as a thriller writer, then there's that element of, does the past ultimately catch up with them again? And so All the Missing Girls,
Interesting.
if you've read it, it is the story about what happened when these characters were 18. And it is now 10 years later. Something has happened again that kind of kicks it into the present. And they're looking back with this element of hindsight. And I did think of the backstory of what happened when they were 18 first. And that was kind of my starting point. So I think, in a way, writing it kind of gave rise to my adult books. I joke with my editor that, somebody a few books ago asked me to describe a book in 3 words. And I said, The Past Returns. And then I said that could literally describe like any of my adult books. And I feel like that's a theme I keep coming back to, and is maybe something that's inspired by thinking about how the past
Hmm.
impacts the present, and how these characters deal with, their pasts as well.
Well, and as you mentioned, that theme is very
Yeah.
present in The Last to Vanish for sure. There's another great audience question, which is one that I had on my list as well. Are you able to read mystery and suspense for pleasure, or do you prefer to read other genres than the one that you write in?
I am. I'm a huge mystery and suspense reader. I grew up reading these types of books. I've always been kind of drawn to the mystery. My mom used to have, she was a big suspense and mystery reader. And so our bookshelves were kind of covered with this at home. And she used to take me to the library every week on her day off, which was Thursdays. And I'd come out with like stacks of books. And they were all types of books. But at a very young age, I was always drawn to these mysteries. And I would say, if something seems too similar in premise, then I'll usually wait until I finish writing the idea, because and it's more of a sense of,
Hmm.
sometimes when I read a premise and it feels too close, I feel like I want to go in a different direction and maybe not stay true to the choices a character would make. Like, you get in your head one way or another about it. And then when you read the books, they often do feel so
Hmm.
different, even if like the big, premise, there's something in the atmosphere. Um, I feel like they are still so different. But if it's too similar in premise, I'll wait. But I completely will always be reading suspense and thrillers. I'm a huge fan.
And a follow-up question, can you share some of your favorite authors and books with us?
Yes, I can. I feel like I'm just going to keep saying book titles. So, some of my favorites, Harlan Coben has been a long time favorite. I love both his, series, the Myron Bolitar series, and also his standalones. Tana French is one of my very favorites. The Dublin Murder
Yes.
Squad series, love it so much. I feel like every one of her books, it's like the plot is perfectly suited for each detective who's narrating the story. Yet
Hmm.
they're brilliant, and I just love her writing and sink into it. I'm a huge fan of all kind of character-driven suspense. So, Jennifer Hillier is one of my favorites. Kimberly McCreight, Mary Kubica, Riley Sager, Kelly Garrett's Like a Sister was one of my favorite books that came out this year. Julie Clark. I feel like I could just keep going, but yes, I'm a huge fan, of so many, authors who are publishing today.
Wonderful. I love that. And I think I've gotten all of those. We'll put a list in the book club favorites group after the event so that listeners can go back and check some of those out. I just want to echo your love for Tana French in
Great.
particular. And I will say that this book, The Last to Vanish, actually reminded me of Tana French a lot. Like, I feel like the richness of the atmosphere and the way that I feel like buildings play a big part in her books a lot of the time, and the way that the passage in, like the inn itself, is so much
Yes.
a part of the story. So I definitely got Tana French vibes from this one.
Ah, thank you. That is the best compliment. I really appreciate that.
You are welcome. So let's see. I got Harlan Coben, Tana French, Jennifer Hiller, Kelly Garrett, like a sister, Julie Clark, Mary
Got Kimberly
Kubica,
McCrae. Yes. Riley Sager.
Riley
Uh,
Sager.
I know I'm forgetting. Wendy Walker is another. Um, yes, I said Kimberly McCrae.
You did.
Yes, Laura Dave.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. We will,
Yeah.
yes, like I said, share those in the book club favorites group after the event. So listeners, I want to remind you, if you have questions for Megan, you can put them in the chat. Thanks to everybody who's been doing that already. We have about maybe 10 or 15 more minutes, so be sure you get those in now. Megan, I think that The Last of Vanish would make a great miniseries. I would love to see this on screen. If it were being turned into a TV show or a movie, who would you cast?
Ah, that is a great question, and also the one I'm the most terrible at answering. Because I feel like, in my mind, they kind of become these, you know, people in your head. And I really like to keep an open mind over, who could possibly
Hmm.
play the different characters, because I think it's so much about just embodying like a persona. And I even imagine like certain characters like Abby just being, somebody who's new, just the way they are new to this world as well. But I love hearing everyone else's ideas for who they would cast. I'm like the worst person to answer this question myself, though.
Oh no, turning it around on me. That is
Roll of
that's
me.
very tricky. um yeah, I don't know. Let's see.
It's hard, right?
Yeah, I feel like Abby's so tricky because you're in her head, right? So like I feel like
Right.
you need someone who's like sort of not too much of a big star because you want them to be like really relatable.
Right.
Um
Like new to this world,
yeah,
new to
yeah.
yeah. No, I do. I think I get that feeling of like
Oh
someone
gosh.
new.
That's hard. Well,
I know, readers, you have to let us
readers
know.
dreamcast
Yeah.
for us in the
Yes.
chat because neither of us are we're drawing blanks here. Let's see. Another audience question. If you weren't a writer, what do you think you'd be doing?
Ooh, good question. So, I will be honest that writing was my third profession. I went to school for biology. I love science, just as much as I loved writing growing up. And like Michael Crichton was one of like my, a huge inspiration when I was in high school. And Jurassic Park was a book that a
Mm-hmm.
teacher gave me that kind of like blew my mind of like the possibilities of what you could do and what you could write and the types of stories that were told. So I worked in biotech, and I did really enjoy working in the world of science. And then when I moved to North Carolina, I was a high school science teacher, and I also enjoyed that. I think if if I were to do something else, it probably would be in the field of teaching. Um, Whether that now went to an element of writing versus science, but I did really enjoy being in a classroom.
Do you think that you would ever write something like would you ever write some science fiction a la Michael Crichton, or are you going to stick with thrillers?
I think I'm going to stick with thrillers, but I'll never say never. So some of my young adult books were, my first books that I wrote for young adults, they were set in the world of high school, and they were inspired by like these what if science ideas. So I do feel like my different careers kind of influenced the types of stories I was telling at first. Um, One of them,
Mm-hmm.
Come Find Me, has a little bit of a science fiction element to it, but I've found that I'm most drawn to and intrigued by this idea of like the mysteries inside people. And that's sort of what my adult suspense centers around. So I feel like these are the types of stories I'm going to be telling for a while. But I'll never say never.
Well, that is a great lead in to our next audience question, which is, are you already thinking about your next book idea when you're working on your current book? How much does your writing process overlap between your projects?
Ooh, that is also a great question. Usually, so I try to focus on it when I'm drafting. I try to focus just on one idea at a time because you do get so deep into this world. And I try to put myself in that headspace as much as possible. What happens for me is when I'm getting to that hard part in the middle of a book is when I start getting like the bright, shiny ideas of like, oh, let me go write this one. I don't have to have it figured out just yet. And I make myself not do that. And I have this little folder where I put some ideas and I let them sit for a while. And so usually it works out that once I turn in my draft to my editor, that's when suddenly that new idea seems to be a lot more concrete and I'm able to start. And I'm
Hmm.
usually able to start very soon after finishing my prior draft. At that point, I can kind of start drafting the new one while editing the old one. I cannot draft two books at once, though, I realize. Like, I really have to compartmentalize them as much as possible. And sometimes, like, having that time where I don't let myself work on the other book is very helpful. Like, it lets the idea kind of ruminate and get a little deeper before I'm ready to start. But I have just turned in my book that should come out next year. So they are pretty, once I finish one, I'm very quickly diving into the next.
Can you tell us anything about that book, or is it under wraps still?
So I won't say too much only because it's still a first draft. And so, because I
Sure.
don't do a lot of upfront plotting, like some things change dramatically from draft to draft. But I'm always drawn to the woods or the mountains or the water. Like I love setting books in and around nature and using that as much as possible. And for this one, we went back to the water. So it takes place in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And all I will say is it is about a group of people who are on a yearly reunion for an event that has happened in their past. And then things go terribly
Oh,
wrong.
excellent. The past coming back
Exactly.
again.
Yes, I can't get away from it.
Um, I like that. I'm curious about, I love those like people come back together, something that has happened. How is everyone reacting to it?
Yes.
That's a trope I
Yes.
like a lot. So I will look forward to that one. Um,
Thank you.
Another question from the audience: how much research is typical for you when you're writing? Given that most of your books are
Ooh,
contemporary, you're not like building out sci-fi, you're not doing like fantasy kind of world building, but what's your research like?
right. Yeah, that's a great question. It really does vary from book to book. So, books that have more of an element of like the police investigation, I'm very, fortunate that I have a detective I'm able to speak to who can kind of walk me through this is the procedure, how it would happen, where I kind of run ideas by. But it really depends on the book. So, this one in particular, I'd say the bulk of research was actually taking trips um, to a location very similar to this. As I said, I grew up hiking and I kind of came back around to it with my own kids. But when I'm hiking with my kids, I don't try to think about like, these are all the terrible and terrifying things that can be happening here. So, yes, but
Yes.
as I was writing this book, I really wanted to be kind of channeling that element of place, but also fear together. And so I took several different trips in different seasons to small towns that were very close to the Appalachian Trail and staying in different inns and bed and breakfasts. And I stayed in several in both Virginia and North Carolina. And, we went in the winter and I went hiking and tried to think about, what was ominous and eerie about this place. I'd never really been hiking in November or December where the trees are so bare and it feels like you can see forever. But on the flip side of this, I realized like there was no place for me to hide either. And then, I went
Hmm.
back, I went to a little town called Hot Springs, North Carolina. in July. And Hot Springs has the Appalachian Trail cuts right through the center of town. There's this trail marker on the sidewalk itself, which is just the coolest thing. This is the most beautiful town. And I went hiking in like the heat of summer there. And I got home and was like, I must make every scene hotter. It was just, it was really, really hot. But so a lot of it just had to do with trying to channel place as much as possible. And then doing research on what different types of missing person cases look like when people go disappear in the wilderness. So it really depends on the book and it varies. I find that visiting a place is very helpful for me. When I was writing The Last House Guest, which is set in Maine, I took a trip up there with my family and went hiking there. And, I find that that is something that really helps me channel the atmosphere and kind of just expand my imagination.
Um, as you were talking about hiking with your kids, I was thinking the topics of these books are pretty dark. Like bad things happen to people, they're mysteries. How do
Yeah.
you sort of spend your time in that world thinking about those kinds of topics and then go back to your real life?
Yeah, I mean, I am someone, I write about dark things, and as a kid or, growing up, I also liked to read this type of book. And I was also a kid who was afraid of a lot of things. So I was like, why am I drawn to these stories where like scary things are happening? And
Mm-hmm.
in hindsight, I think it is because as the reader, you're kind of taking the journey through with these character and you're making it through the other side. And I always try to view my plots and my stories more as the character arc before the plot arc. And where is this character going to get to at the end? And seeing it through that perspective, like these are things you're getting through. Um, Kind of puts a different, I guess, perspective as I'm writing on it. The research, though, is something that
Mm-hmm.
can be very heavy as I'm working through things. And so for me, the routine of having like a place that I do this work every day, I'm very structured in my work hours. I started writing when my kids were 1 and 3, when they were sleeping at night, and now they're in high school, so I write very structured hours during school hours, basically. And I leave my laptop in my office at the end of the day, close the office door behind me, leave that part of my life behind, leave that research behind, and kind of enter the rest of my day. And so that compartmentalizing is something that's very helpful for me. And also helps me get back into it in the morning when I come up to my office. And, just having those routines is very helpful.
So we have just a couple more audience questions. And listeners, if you have a question, this is last call for questions. Let's see. Was there a book you read that solidified your decision to begin writing? Like, was there a book you read and you thought, I want to do that and I think I can?
Oh, yeah. I feel like I've been inspired by books my entire life. That I always was, reading, even when I stopped writing. So when I went away to college and with the intention of keeping writing on the side, the truth is I let it go for a while and I didn't come back to it for about a decade, but I was always, always reading. And right before I started, writing and setting myself the goal of finishing my first book, I'd been reading, a lot of young adult books in addition to adult books. And I'd say a few that were really inspirational for me were John Green's Looking for Alaska and Mary Pearson's The Adoration of Gemma
Mm-hmm.
Fox. I felt like with both of those, I read them and was just transported back to a different time of my life. And I think a lot about what makes a book linger is like the emotion that it leaves you with, or a feeling. And I could remember the books even as a child that left me with that
Mm-hmm.
feeling. I remember like Bridge to Terabithia was kind of the book that the first one I remember really just like catching me off guard and that
Mm-hmm.
feeling kind of lingering. Um, I was a huge Nancy Drew reader. I love that feeling of surprise and the mystery reveal. So there have been so many. I mean, I think Gone Girl was a huge shift of like what was possible as you were reading different types of suspense novels. So I'd say, from childhood through adulthood through now, I'm kind of continually inspired by other books.
Let's see. Any suggestions for dealing with procrastination or writer's block?
Oh, yes. How did you know I have procrastination and writer's block? Yes. So, for me, so much of it is routine, and routine really, really is what gets me through those hard parts. Because, like I said, beginnings are fun and exciting, and so are endings. And I would abandon so many books mid project once I got to middle if it weren't for like the routine of we have to get through this scene to get to the next. And so I give myself little tricks where I say to myself, okay, just write dialogue or just write action and just get to the next scene. And, you can't fix something that's not on the page. And so much of my work is revision. And so I feel like if I get something down, then I can come back and make it stronger. No one wants to see my first drafts. Like they all get better as you go. But just knowing those things about myself, that middles are always going to be difficult. Although I will say sometimes writer's block for me is also that I've gone in a wrong direction because I don't do a lot of plotting up front. Sometimes if I can't see where to go from there, sometimes it's that I need to move backward and see where I might have taken a wrong turn. And sometimes because of that, like progress is deleting. So I try not to place too much emphasis on just a word count or a page count, but on, story progress, and that every scene or every draft or every change gets me closer to my finished product or where it needs to be.
All right. One last question, kind of going back to that idea of like writing on this topic that can be kind of dark. Yeah. Do you ever need to just do something completely different to clear your head? Like you go watch a movie, go out with your friends, like get yourself out of that world? Or is that routine enough?
I find the routine is generally enough, though I will say I am like a huge fan of, I watch comedies at night, and maybe that is to kind of clear my head. And yes, there are times where like I'm just going to read some rom-coms. Like I love Emily Henry's books. Like definitely sometimes you're like, I need to get into a lighter headspace. But I find that, I no longer really watch darker shows at night. I'm always kind of in the head clearing kind of comedy enjoyment before I go to bed.
I like that, protecting yourself a little bit.
Yeah.
All right. So since Likewise is a cross-category platform, we like to ask people to tell us the last great book you read, the last great movie or TV show you watched, and the last great podcast that you listened to.
Okay. Yes. So 2 books. So the most recent great book I finished was The House Across the Lake by Riley Sager. I'm a huge fan of his books. I really, really enjoy them. And the one I'm currently reading is Janelle Brown's I'll Be You. And I'm loving it. It's about identical twins who were child actors, and they kind of drift apart in adulthood until one goes missing. So it is like so many of my favorite elements in a book. So would definitely recommend that as well. Let's see, podcasts. So I get a lot of podcast recommendations from like people will send me things like I was thinking of you and you would enjoy this. And so the 2 most recent episodes I was sent that I just listened to, they're very different, but they were both sent by my mom and she nailed it with both of them. And it was Stuff You Should Know. And one was on the Appalachian Trail. It was on the history of the Appalachian Trail, which I was like, I would have loved to read this, listen to this even before I wrote this book, which is more helpful. And then the other is on, it was the episode called The Disappearance of the Yuba County Five. And it was this, this mystery, a lingering mystery of the tragedy of what happened to 5 young men on the way home from a basketball game, and their car was found in the mountains. And it was so mysterious and haunting. And TV shows, 2 shows that I just kind of devoured the most recent season For All Mankind, which is one of my favorites. And
Yes.
Hacks. I feel like I was late coming to the show Hacks, and I am obsessed with it. Love it so much. Wish I had not finished this season so quickly.
Somebody in the audience strongly agrees with you on Hacks there.
Yay.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Megan. Where can listeners find you online?
Yeah, I am on Instagram, probably. That's the one I'm on most often. I'm there at Megan L. Miranda. Also Twitter at Megan L. Miranda, and on Facebook at author Megan Miranda.
All right. And listeners, if you want to read The Last to Vanish for your book club, there is a book club guide on the website, on Megan's website as well. And don't forget to add The Last to Vanish to your saves, and be sure you pick it up if you haven't already. It was a great summer thriller read. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being with us, Megan. And heads up, listeners, we have more author events coming up soon. Next week, we're hosting Aman Hariri Kia to talk about her debut, 100 Other Girls. And that is it. Thank you again, Megan. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much. This was so fun. And thank you, everyone, for joining.